I have run out of excuses. Ever since I started the show, I was waiting for the right moment, the right time to talk about such an anime. For years I have delayed the inevitable, opted to talk about some pretty good Fatal Fury anime and some pretty bad Tekken, Samurai Showdown, and Art of Fighting anime instead of the anime you wanted. Today, no more lame justifications. The time is here and now. You've been waiting for this. This will fly at this location. Today, we enter the heat of battle, prepare to strike, and keep following the dream. Get ready for action, viewers. I'm making the first move. What's it gonna be? Let's go. Street Fighter 2. What else needs to be said? Imagine a world without Street Fighter 2: The World Warrior. You cannot. A world without Street Fighter 2 is a world without the FGC. A world without the arcade gaming culture of the 90s. A world without, well, fighting games. Like how Nirvana's Nevermind brought music into the 90s, Street Fighter 2 did the same for video games. It pushed arcade gaming into a new realm with its pinpoint accurate joystick and button scanning, along with the then detailed graphics of Capcom's CPS chipset. It laid the groundwork for future fighting game mechanics with the introduction of the combo mechanic, chaining multiple attacks without giving your opponent time to answer. It spawned multiple imitators who would eventually blossom into classic fighting game franchises in their own right through future rival developers like SNK and Midway. Even outside the arcade scene, which Street Fighter 2 had revitalized by being the best-selling cabinet since the early 80s, the game was also a smash on consoles. Street Fighter was the best-selling third-party title on the Super Nintendo, selling around 6.3 million units globally, second only to Super Mario World. And most of all, Street Fighter 2 popularized the appeal of gaming as a competition. According to John Romero, the idea for deathmatch mode in Doom stemmed from him participating in Street Fighter multiplayer. That's why it's so hard to imagine a world without Street Fighter 2. It feels like it has always existed. The game, its mechanics, its fighters, they all permeate popular culture in some way or another. But like with all things, it did not get that way overnight. Street Fighter 2 came out in the middle of a healthy monoculture, so it had time to really develop its legacy. For the first half of the 90s, Capcom was conscious to always keep the game in the spotlight through regular re-releases that added new characters while tweaking and improving gameplay mechanics. Eventually, they would take it to the next level by spreading the franchise's wings into other avenues. By the mid-90s, Capcom was transforming Street Fighter from a simple gaming franchise to a media empire. Street Fighter 2 was no longer just going to be a game, but also a movie, a video game based off of said movie, and a Saturday morning cartoon. Yes! Yes! Now, the qualities of all three are generally considered by most to be suspect, but in this grand expansion of media, there was one that, by design, felt the most niche, at least at the time.
KYOTO ビデオ
Released in Japan on August 6, 1994, and in the United States that very next year, Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, has a reputation as being the best of the Street Fighter adaptations that came out during this media blitz. Or, at the very least, the most faithful.
Of course!
I always knew I was going to get around to this baby one of these days. Out of all the fighting game adaptations, it's this one that feels like it towers above the rest, standing roughly shoulder to shoulder to only the Fatal Fury movie and specials, a position they earned by not being cheap crappy cash-ins like the rest.
Everyone freeze! Party party's over. You're under arrest.
Indeed, this does not look like one of those cheap OVAs the studios could have commissioned for peanuts that plagued the video stores in those days. Street Fighter II, the animated movie, feels like a big movie, the biggest one we've seen thus far. Every other fighting game adaptation I've covered so far might as well just be a warm-up. And since this year has seen the release of Street Fighter VI, which is currently familiarizing the newest generation of kids with these characters outside of Fortnite dances, the time is right to cover this. Street Fighter II, the animated movie, might be the most faithful and most stunningly animated fighting game adaptation we've seen thus far. But is that enough to hold it to any critical scrutiny? Well, I shouldn't have to tell you, the audience, that the answer lies in the heart of battle.
You haven't seen anything! Get ready!
I've already covered most of the prehistory of Street Fighter in my Fatal Fury Legends of the Hungry Wolf video, but if you don't want to exit out of this video to watch that one, here's a quick recap. Irem developer Takashi Nishiyama develops the arcade game Kung Fu Master, widely regarded as the first side-scrolling beat-em-up. Capcom poaches Nishiyama from Irem for the development of their own game, Trojan. Nishiyama's next project is centered around the idea of a beat-em-up where you fight one enemy at a time. This ends up being the original Street Fighter, which pioneered fighting game standards like 6-button controls and command-based special moves. Nishiyama then leaves Capcom for SNK, where he would go on to develop the Neo Geo arcade system and their own fighting game series, Fatal Fury. Which brings us to the dawn of the 90s. After seeing the massive, rapid overseas commercial success of their 1989 beat-em-up Final Fight, Capcom threw themselves into making more fighting games, particularly wanting to make another versus fighting game in the vein of the original Street Fighter. According to game producer Yoshiki Okamoto, the idea was to revive Street Fighter and rebuild it into a better sequel. Development began shortly after Final Fight's release with a team of about 35 to 40 people and an estimated budget of $2,450,000 USD at the time. One big thing designers Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda wanted to do going from 1 to 2 was to revamp the characters and make them feel more larger than life. They wanted to give each character a memorable design along with an exciting moveset and special attacks that fit both their martial art of choice and their cartoonish nationality. I might have had a small hand in it, but I think it came from everyone wanting to make their characters strong and interesting. More was a popular phrase among the dev team. Make them more interesting, make them more cool, stuff like that. Another development that might not have been intentional was the invention of the combo system. A big priority of development was improving mechanics that people found aggravating in the original Street Fighter, making the controls more responsive to inputs and the like. One thing they did to relieve pressure off of players was to loosen the timing of the inputs required to do special moves like Ryu's Hadouken. But when doing a bug check on the car bonus stage, producer Noritaka Funamizu found out that the loose input timing allowed you to add a second and third hit to your move. By early January 1991, location testing for Street Fighter II began, and the game was exhibited at London's Amusement Trade Exposition International. On February 1st, at Capcom's distributor conference in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Street Fighter II was revealed to the global public as the greatest video game ever.
There's only one official strategy guide to Street Fighter 2. One place to learn the crushing combos. One place to master the killer throws. One place to analyze the awesome attacks. One place to study the special techniques. Announcing the all-new official strategy guide for Street Fighter 2 from the Masters of Menace, GamePro magazine. Look for it this fall and discover a whole new way to get your kicks.
Flash forward to 1994, and Street Fighter II is still one of the hottest games in arcades, even after facing stiff competition from the far bloodier Mortal Kombat. This could be credited with Capcom continuing to add and refine the game with new iterations. Champion Edition emphasized the initially hidden combo system while making the 4 boss characters playable, Turbo increased the speed and added additional moves, Super updated the graphics and audio while adding 4 more additional characters, and this ultimately culminated in Super Street Fighter II Turbo, arguably considered to be the canonical and most complete version of Street Fighter II, with its selective game speed, the addition of super combos, and the most famous hidden character of them all, Akuma. 1994 is the peak of Street Fighter II's relevance in the mainstream with Super Turbo's release, and Capcom intended to capitalize on that hard with not one big movie, but 2 big movies. On August 19th, 1993, Capcom Japan held an official Street Fighter II Turbo tournament at Ryogoku Sumo Hall in Tokyo, Japan. After 17-year-old Sagat player Takahiro Nakano emerged victorious as champion, Capcom Japan made the formal announcement. There was going to be an anime movie based on Street Fighter II to release the following year. Not only was it going to feature the original 12 from Championship Edition, Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, E Honda, Blanca, Guile, Zangief, Dalsum, Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison, but also the 4 new fighters introduced in Super, Fei Long, Cammy, DJ, and T-Hawk. And more importantly, leading the charge as producer would be Kenichi Imai, who is currently working with Hollywood producer Edward Pressman on the live-action Street Fighter movie, which was currently in pre-production. And boy, the story behind that classic is certainly its own video production foibles.
Quick! Change the channel!
Animation production would be done by the studio Group Tak, who at the time had gotten done co-producing Nadia, Secret of Blue Water with Studio Gainax, and were mostly now doing a bunch of forgotten children and gag anime. In the director's chair, Capcom selected storyboarder Masashi Ikeda for the job. With the studio and director selected, Capcom allowed production to commence. But no sooner had production started that it encountered a big problem. According to official sources, when presenting his storyboards to the Capcom higher-ups, Ikeda ended up getting into a huge argument with them. It's unknown what exactly caused the creative differences, but it resulted in Ikeda angrily walking off the project, going over to Sunrise, and directing Gundam Wing. This sent the head producer of Group Tak, Ken Fujita, into a huge panic. Capcom had already given the studio a massive budget that amounted to 6 million USD, and if the project was cancelled after the fact, it would send Group Tak into bankruptcy. In a desperate maneuver, Fujita got in contact with his former Mushi Pro colleague and veteran anime film director Gizaburo Sugi to rescue them. One day, Tak's producer Ken Fujita came bursting in with a pale face and said, "Gi-chan, you've got to help us. Street Fighter II's director quit, but we've already taken the money for the project, and if we don't do something, our company will collapse." I don't really understand the circumstances, but it seemed like Ikeda-kun got into a dispute with Capcom. I think they gave him some orders at the storyboard stage. While Sugi did agree to it, the troubles did not end there. You see, Sugi was of the old guard of animators, meaning he was unfamiliar with video games, let alone Street Fighter II. When he actually saw gameplay for research, he had a hard time visualizing the pixel art as something that could be adapted into anime. Worse yet, when Sugi met with producer Imai, he was told that Group Tak only had a 6-month time frame for animation production. Since the live-action Street Fighter movie had a December 1994 release set in stone, which it was also struggling to meet. That meant that the animated movie had to come out before that date for promotional purposes. And since Group Tak was currently halfway through a year-long contract with Capcom, they were not in a position to negotiate.
Is this a joke?
Sugi had no choice. If he wanted to save Group Tak from bankruptcy, he was going to have to unleash his inner gamer, and fast. Luckily for him, he wouldn't have to go far. Turns out, the movie story had a framework in the form of a Street Fighter II movie script that Imai had been working on for years without Capcom's permission. It was through the screenplay, dubbed Storm 2, that he was able to visualize an epic story for the movie, after a few revisions of course. Helping him out with his video game blind spots was acquaintance Takuji Endo, who had retired from the animation field and was working in a bookstore at the time. Sugi knew he was a games fan and appointed him as an assistant director to help him get familiarized with the world of Street Fighter II. For that incredibly demanding 6-month turnaround time, Sugi was able to get it done on time, surprisingly enough. Using the budget Capcom gave him, he hired 3 times the normal staff for a typical production and divided them up into 3 groups. Reasoning that 6 months of production time was only reasonable for a high-quality 30-minute film, he had each group only focus on 3 30-minute chunks of the movie that would be stitched together into a full 90-minute feature. According to Sugi, trickery had to be done, but it was ultimately the reason why Street Fighter II, the animated movie, miraculously made it to its release date. When Street Fighter II made its release date that August, it was screened at a single theater in Tokyo as Capcom planned to make most of its money on direct-to-video sales. Despite such limited release, it was a smash hit, netting around 29 million in USD. Already, Capcom had a success on their hands, and they hadn't even hit their target market overseas. Street Fighter II the animated movie was probably going to be a bit harder to sell in America thanks to it being an anime. While anime was gaining ground amongst the consuming populace at the time, it was still an incredibly niche thing, even among nerd circles, so localizers at SMV Enterprises would have to go the extra mile to convince people to buy it. At the very least, they weren't held back by the performance of the live-action movie, which, despite being critically savaged and only opening at number 3 at the box office, was still commercially successful for Capcom, making back its budget and then some. Still, Capcom and SMV were not taking chances here, even if their competition on the home video market set the bar really low. Two English dub versions were released, a PG-13 cut and an unrated cut, the former of which removed more violent scenes from the film, toning the dialogue down to be less colorful.
Bison, I'm gonna rip your lousy heart out, you filthy creep! Bison, I'm gonna rip your lousy heart out, you filthy bastard!
And, most famously, completely excising an extended shower scene of thick-thighed Chun-Li, where we get to see a nice long glimpse of her naked breasts and buns. There were some localization changes, of course, mostly to fit in with the ones made for the original video games, obviously, but the one that personally bugs me is changing the villains' organization names from Shadowloo to Shadow Law.
Shadow Law.
Shadow Law.
Shadow Law.
Shadow Law.
Shadow Law.
I think we can chalk this one up to mistranslation, but boy does it not sound right.
You'll soon learn that Shadow Law does not forgive mistakes.
But perhaps the most famous change in localization is the addition of licensed music. SMV was a division of Sony after all, so they had the means to replace Komuro Tetsuya's score with some of the finest Gen X cuts your dirtbag older brother vibed with. Korn, Alice in Chains, Silverchair, the works. But I like the licensed soundtrack. Not only do I think locking a movie in time with soundtrack choices is more of a feature than a bug, but I also think the tracks like these add some necessary spice to the proceedings. Chun-Li's big hotel skirmish with Vega is already great, but KMFDM's Ultra, the soundtrack to so many anime VHS promos, makes it even better. Voice acting in both the original Japanese and English dub feels very utilitarian. A lot of safe directing choices in regards to the acting on both sides of the pond. Although for the English dub, it can give us some pretty funny moments of the characters delivering some of the stupidest lines with the straightest of faces.
Any man strong enough to beat the crap out of a Sagat is a man I want found.
Hey, brushhead! This is not a request!
Now move your cute little butt before I run it over.
In Japan, a good chunk of the voice actors were not established seiyuu, but actual film actors like idol singer Kojiro Shimizu voicing Ryu,
俺の名前は龍。旅をしているだけの日本人だ。戦うつもりはない。
and Miki Fujitani voicing Chun-Li, who I only bring up as this was one of 2 voices she has ever done in her career, with the other being Miss Kaoru from Rurouni Kenshin. Those are 2 pretty big roles.
今やベガはあなたの親友の敵というだけではないのです。
おしゃべりだけじゃベガは倒せねえぜ。
それなら腕の方もお試しになったら？
Looking at the English cast, you would assume that a lot of them are a bunch of no-names, but a good chunk of them are early voice talent working under pseudonyms thanks to what I can only assume to be complicated union rules. You have a young Kurt Thornton voicing Guile.
I came to tell you that we found Bison's hideout. I guess you'll chew me out for this, but I'll get revenge for what he did to both of us.
Bo Billingsley playing a very stereotypical DJ.
Yahoo! They are some badass motherfuckers. I am honored.
And Asteroid City's own Bryan Cranston playing Fei Long.
Not bad, or was it just luck? Let's see how well you do against a fighter like me.
But if I had to pick a personal favorite voice actor from the English dub, it would have to be Richard Epcar as E. Honda. The most seasoned of the bunch at this time, he is having a lot of fun as Ryu's unexpectedly closest and most jovial ally in the fight against M. Bison.
Tush, my man. I might have lost the fight if you hadn't been around. Here, keep it. Japanese fighters stick together.
Both the edited and uncut versions of Street Fighter II, the animated movie, sold extremely well on the home video market. The combined sales of both netted around 500,000 units sold by 1996. It was noticeable to the point that Billboard magazine, who was measuring these sales at the time, said that it was a sign of anime becoming more of a mainstream force in America. Oh lord, they have no idea what's coming in the next 2 years. So in summation, despite a few production hiccups, Street Fighter II, the animated movie, was a success in theaters in its home country, and its success on the home video market in America all but guaranteed that Japanese anime was poised for a massive breakthrough in the mainstream. Does that mean the movie is good? Street Fighter II, the animated movie, getting done within a 6-month time frame is, in many ways, a goddamn miracle. MAPPA wishes they could get results like this that fast, and Group Tech seemingly did it without sacrificing scores of animators to the animation gods. This is just a high-quality animated feature. It might just be the best looking animated adaptation of a fighting game in the history of the medium, which is another low bar to clear of course, but even putting it up against another high quality, stylistically ambitious anime film like Fatal Fury the movie, Street Fighter rises slightly above it. Sugi's 3-team approach was an experiment that paid off, and with having each 30-minute chunk helmed by a different animation director, it made the consistency seen throughout this anime even more impressive. Sure, there are some moments where the characters' models bend a little off tone, but they are few, and they don't distract from the overall bigness this movie has. Capcom wanted their big epic anime Street Fighter movie, and baby did they ever get it. Satoshi Matsuoka's art direction gives the world of Street Fighter a sense of scale that not even the video games could reach at that time. Shuko Murase takes the two Akira's designs of fighters and crafts them into true world warriors. In spite of their obvious comic book anatomy, he somehow makes them feel realistically human, which makes the feats they can do with their bodies and martial prowess way more impressive. Speaking of, you know what you all came here for. We needed to see the Street Fighters and their moves in action. Like with every fighting game anime adaptation, the real meat is in the fights, and they do not disappoint. It's clear every animator on this project had the game footage close by to use as reference because they nail every move, making them look their best, which makes the fighters look their best. You feel the crackling of energy from Ryu's Hadoken, the wind cutting through the atmosphere from Guile's Sonic Boom, the force of every single kick from Chun-Li's spinning bird kick. Every single move each fight has tangible power behind it. And then you have the choreography of the fights where every single kick, punch, and dodge is readable, showing multiple angles, pure one-on-one martial combat lighting up the screen. Even in this seemingly simple shots, the combat feels gripping because it's emulating the style of the original video game. Even when there is no combat to be found, the animators still give us some unnecessarily gorgeous bit of character animation like this cut of Chun-Li braiding her hair. It's clear that Sugi ran a tight ship, and his method of delivering an excellent work of art in such a small time frame worked. However, even if you did produce a great looking film in 6 months, that short amount of time for production might just be the root cause for some of Street Fighter II's flaws. When you look at the animation of Street Fighter II, the animated movie, the fact that it was done in 6 months is incredible. When you look at the story of Street Fighter II, the animated movie, the fact that it was done in 6 months is completely unsurprising. The whole concept is supposed to follow what is essentially the main plot of the games. The crime syndicate Shadaloo, led by M. Bison and his 3 bodyguards, Vega, Balrog, and Sagat, are hypnotizing super soldiers and martial artists all over the world to act as assassins. Interpol agent Chun-Li teams up with United States military captain Guile to track down the group and put an end to their activities, and between all that, Ryu is walking the earth to seek out worthy opponents and winds up getting involved with the plot after Bison kidnaps his longtime friend and fighting rival Ken Masters. By the end, these two plot lines merge and we have a big final battle where Ryu fights Bison alongside Ken. Easy as pie, right? Well, the framework is straightforward, but the execution is a mess. It appears that the goal of the script was not to tell the story of the games, but to find a conceivable way to cram every single fighter into the narrative and work backwards from there. So that means no matter what happens in the story, every single fighter needs to make an appearance and have a moment. It's the common weakness of every fighting game anime adaptation, even the good ones. Fatal Fury the motion picture had a smaller roster to work with, and even they still struggled to give every cast member a meaningful scene. Street Fighter 2 has 16 characters, 18 if you count Violent Ken and Akuma, whose only appearance is him randomly being in the background of a shot where he is not saying anything or doing anything. And they all must be crammed into the picture one way or another, and the inclusion of some characters are going to feel unavoidably awkward.
Oh, please.
Of course, Ryu, Ken, Guile, Chun-Li, and the Shadaloo fighters are going to get plenty of screen time since main character status and all, but the placement of everyone else as secondary characters feels off. Cammy's only role is to be an example of how Shadaloo is hypnotizing martial artists by having her act as an assassin for a politician in one kick-ass scene. But aside from that scene and a brief interrogation scene with Chun-Li, that's all she gets. For someone who plays a large role in the canonical story and also has a stake in taking down Bison for using her as a weapon, you'd think she'd have more of a role to play. It's more egregious with how Fei Long is handled. He is given quite a bit of setup and backstory before he has his fight with Ryu in the first act of the film. After he gets beat, it almost looks like the movie is setting him up to be an important ally going forward. Nah, he's just gone from the movie after he tells Ryu to be on the lookout for Shadaloo. That's the thing with most of the cast in this picture. They show up, do one of their signature moves, and then leave. It exposes the film for what it is. A wrestling show. I think this really became apparent when I saw how fan favorite Zangief and Blanka were handled. They only show up for one scene to participate in a Las Vegas cage fight against each other. The movie stops dead just to have these two duke it out. But not only do we get to see who wins, the scene cuts right as Blanka gains the upper hand, but those two don't even get lines of dialogue aside from having generic combat grunts. It's clear that the team didn't have a spot to put them in the story, so they had to shove this scene in here because not including them would be inexcusable, only loosely tying it back to the main story by having Balrog scowling in the audience. Sometimes the characters don't even get a true fight scene. T-Hawk's scene is just him showing up in a random alley just to get jobbed by Ken, and DJ's only purpose is to be warned about Shadaloo's robot Sagat soldiers while he's busy beating up a group of randos. Oh, I forgot to mention the most pointless aspect of the movie. Shadaloo has an army of androids that look like Sagat, and the only thing they do is silently monitor all the other fighters fighting, and adding this pointless and visually distracting computer screen filter over the scenes. Out of all the great fight scenes, it's the only weak link.
They're searching the world collecting statistics on fighters who can serve their purposes.
Shit, they don't want me, so this ain't my problem.
But to me, the biggest flaw out of everything in this film is that outside the fight scenes, everything moves so slow. For a movie that was on an expedited timetable, it sure doesn't feel that way with how many scenes drag. There's a scene in India where Ryu bumps into a little girl causing her to spill the milk she bought for her mother, and he pays her back to show us just how he's not just a fighter but a man of good character. But it's stretched out to such a degree and with so much dead air in between that it was obvious Capcom was asking Group Tat to turn a 60-minute OVA into a 90-minute feature. The story might have been better executed if Ryu and Ken's plotline had not swallowed it up whole. What was initially presented as an ensemble piece becomes the story of Ryu trying to rescue his best buddy Ken. Chun-Li gets put out of commission after her fight with Vega, and Guile gets his ass absolutely handed to him and has to be rescued by Honda in the final battle. And I know he's the face of the franchise, but there's a reason why the joke among Street Fighter fans about Ryu is about his blandness.
My favorite things are jumping into light fierce, stale bread, water without any ice, the newest season of The Simpsons, and dirt.
Hey, they could barely fit Geef and Blanka-chan in this movie, but you have to understand, they needed that fourth extended flashback of Ryu and Ken training together. How else are we going to know that they're best friends? So with haphazard execution of plot and characters, and exhausted pacing keeping Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, from being a truly top-tier film, I have to ask, are fighting game anime adaptations just destined to be like this? After 5 years of talking about fighting game anime with more to come, I've seen the same problems crop up time and time again. Bare bones plot with every single fighter crammed in clown car style, with the only saving grace being awesome fight scenes. If they're even there, of course. My point is that even a grade A franchise like Street Fighter, at the peak of its power and relevance, blessed with a handsome budget and a team of animators working their damnedest to deliver a film worthy of the Street Fighter name, was still not immune from these problems. It's great as an animation showcase of martial arts. When you just look at the fights, you see a true cinematic blockbuster. That to me is what makes this film worth watching ultimately. I just wish that everything else in between was also worth watching. Fatal Fury's cinematic outing had its issues, but they at least knew they were making a movie and needed to have some emotional through line. Street Fighter only sees its movie as an avenue that leads to more fights, which is why it struggles to reach that 90-minute mark through its incessant padding. Am I asking too much from this anime? After all, it did give us what it set out to do, a movie with all 16 Street Fighter characters, so I can't really fault it for doing that. But when you have a fighting game anime that looks this spectacular, I feel like it needs to be more than that. Maybe if they had given it more time in the oven to develop, but considering how it got to that point in the first place, I doubt Capcom had bigger ambitions for this movie beyond a blockbuster budget. Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, doesn't look or feel like a cheap cash-in. Therefore, they shouldn't have treated it like one.